Hi. So I'm Avery Keats, and this is my 8th grade project on why the minimum wage needs to be raised. So this is a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt during a 1938 address he gave about one of his economic salvation packages. No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wage to its workers has any right to continue in this country. Now, this quote is a great example of what the original intentions were for the minimum wage. When he signed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which established a mandatory minimum hourly wage of 25 cents per hour back then, FDR intended for it to be enough for a person to make a decent living off of. However, in the 83 years since, the minimum wage has fallen far back on that goal, despite being increased dozens of times since. As of 2021, the minimum wage in America has been the same for a record 12 years, with the last increase being in 2009. It's $7.25. So, why does the minimum wage need to be raised? I think the main reasons for this is because it's not enough for the 32 million minimum wage workers to live comfortably. It would help boost the economy by circulating more money, and the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation since 1968. So one common misconception about the minimum wage is that it is a living wage. In fact, people often use these terms interchangeably. However, these are two very different terms. The minimum wage is an amount required by the law to pay workers per hour, whereas the living wage is determined by average cost to live in a given place. These two amounts of money are very rarely the same, as the average living wage in the U.S. is more than 2 times the federal minimum wage, as you can see here. Now, the minimum wage is actually a very topical issue right now because of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, which proposes gradually increasing the minimum wage each year until it's $15 in 2025. It's sponsored by Senator and former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, and although it didn't end up making the cut, it was almost included in the COVID-19 relief bill back in February. Now, here's a chart on the Raise the Wage Act, and the Raise the Wage Act is pretty widely supported in America right now, as you can see. According to this poll taken by the Pew Research Center in May 2019, 67% of people surveyed somewhat or strongly support raising the minimum wage to $15 by 2025, and only 15% of people strongly oppose it, which really shows how popular the idea is. And again, 32 million people make the minimum wage in America, so this would have an effect on a lot of people. Now, the first reason why the minimum wage needs to be increased is because it isn't enough to live comfortably, namely because it isn't even close to a living wage, as you can see in this table right here. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, aka MIT, actually set up a website that calculated the minimum wage, poverty wage, and living wage for whatever city, state, or county you want. So, in most places in the U.S., the minimum wage is the federal wage of $7.25. And the average living wage, like I said earlier, is $16.54, which is actually a bit higher than here in Durham, where it's $16.02. However, some places, particularly in big cities, have higher minimum wages due to the higher cost of living there. For example, as you can see here, in places like Boston, Massachusetts, Manhattan, New York, and Washington, D.C., they have higher minimum wages, but their living wages are also way higher than in other places like Durham, so it doesn't make much of a difference in the end. And the same with the lowest living wage, which isn't included here, is Kentucky, which has a living wage of $13.48. But that's still over $6 more than the minimum wage there. And the average poverty wage in America is $6.13, which is obviously much closer to the minimum wage than the minimum wage to the living wage. So the minimum wage really is nowhere near enough for people to make a living wage out of anywhere in America. Whoa. Oops. Got it. So, raising the minimum wage would also give a huge boost to the economy for a few reasons. First, it would affect poverty and family income. It would obviously benefit the 32 million people who get paid living wage, since their wages would eventually more than double. They would earn an extra $3,300 per year, which makes a huge difference when added to the just $15,000 they make annually, typically. Now, when you have all this money being added into the system and circulated around, it helps stimulate the economy, and in turn, that helps business and job growth. Additionally, the amount of people below the poverty line would see an instant decrease of about 900,000 people. And another big advantage to raising the minimum wage is that it would begin to reverse decades of pay inequality, especially in terms of gender and race. This was seen before in the late 1960s, where the highest value minimum wage has been in America, the equivalent of $11 today, accounted for a 20% pay gap decrease in the 70s between men and women. If the minimum wage was increased to $15 an hour by 2025, 31% of African Americans and 26% of Latinos would get a raise. Women in particular would benefit, who currently make up 59% of the minimum wage workforce. So the Raise the Wage Act would absolutely help to boost the economy for quite a few reasons. Now this graph by the Washington Post shows the minimum wages over time compared to their values today when inflation is accounted for. And when you take inflation into consideration, the current minimum wage is actually much less than past minimum wages, at about the same value it was in the mid-1940s. For example, the peak purchasing power of the minimum wage was in 1968, when the minimum wage was set to $1.60, which is about $11 today when you adjust it for inflation. That's almost $4 more than the minimum wage today. And 1968 was also the last year that tracked evenly with inflation and productivity growth. If it still kept up with inflation, it would be about $24 today, more than 3 times what it actually is. However, I'm definitely not arguing that the minimum wage should be raised to that level, at least not anytime soon, because that would cause massive inflation, which would kind of defeat the purpose, and unemployment rates would skyrocket. This graph really shows how the value of the minimum wage has decreased over time, even since the last increase in 2009, as you can see over by the right end of the graph. And $7.25 in 2009 had the same purchasing power back then as $9 does now, which is about 25% more than it is now. And the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation at all, even during the past 12 years, and the Raise the Wage Act would really help fix that. So a common counterargument to raising the minimum wage is that while it would benefit millions of workers and boost the economy, it may also cause a small spike in the unemployment rate initially. For example, a lot of small business owners may not be able to afford to pay their workers if the minimum wage was higher, so they would have to lay them off or close their businesses. Another common argument of opponents is that raising the minimum wage would cause inflation. However, in some of the scenarios currently proposed, such as the 5-year plan to raise it, several studies have shown that if there was inflation, it would be very small and not make much of a noticeable difference due to the gradual rate of increase. So overall, I personally think the benefits far outweigh any of the drawbacks it might have. So in conclusion, I think the minimum wage clearly needs to be increased, and it's not enough for someone to live comfortably. A raise would boost the economy and hasn't kept up with inflation for over 50 years. So even though there are a few possible issues that could come with it, I think that if it's done right, a higher minimum wage could benefit countless people and America for years to come. So here's my bibliography. Any questions? Blaney?
So do you think that the minimum wage should be the same as the living wage, or do you think it should be higher?
Well, I think it should be the same as the living wage, but the current offer that's the most likely is for it to be $15 by 2025, which is still about $1.50 less than the living wage in most places, but it's pretty good. So, Will?
So, obviously the approval rating for the minimum wage among average Americans is pretty high, especially right now.
Yeah.
In Washington, among politicians in Congress, it isn't. So why do you think the reason for that would be? It's around 50%.
Honestly, I'm not sure. I think it's probably because a lot more, like, most of the people in Congress don't make minimum wage, and a lot of people in America do, so they would be able to relate to those people more and understand why it needs to be raised. James?
Do you think support for the minimum wage act will dwindle as COVID fades away?
Well, I don't think so, because that survey was taken in May 2019, which was before COVID. So I think the support may have even gotten higher now during COVID. So hopefully no. Sophie?
So do you have the hope that if this bill is passed and we're able to raise the minimum wage to $15 by 2025, that yes, inflation will inevitably raise itself? Do you have the high hope that the minimum wage will also raise as inflation raises, making it a balanced and have affordable living conditions for all of America for years to come?
Yes, I think that's a big intention of the Raise the Wage Act, is why they're increasing it in increments year by year, so it won't cause just a giant spike in inflation immediately. So yeah, but I hope so. Yeah, Devin?
Do you think it would be a better idea to just adjust the minimum wage to inflation instead of raising it?
I
So
do.
it stays permanently tied to inflation instead of ever being raised?
I do not think they should do that, at least not immediately, maybe over a really long period of time. But seeing as if it was adjusted for inflation today, it would be $24. And if we did that, it would cause a bit too much inflation, and then it wouldn't keep up with inflation then, and it would just
Like, you
spiral out of
depending on
control.
how much the currency inflated, the minimum wage would go up by that amount?
I'm sorry, what?
If, suppose the minimum wage would go up by the amount that the currency inflated, so your wage stays the same value?
I'm just hoping that it'll start to be fixed because it is way below what it should be, and the Raise the Wage Act would at least partially help that. So, and this is just in the near future.
Yeah.
We can't really see what'll happen in the next 50 years or so. Silver?
So you mentioned that like different cities have different like living and minimum wages. Do you think that raising the minimum wage would affect the cities that have different minimum wages? Like, do you think they would increase as well?
I think it probably would because, like, most of those big cities, the minimum wage is around $12, and if the minimum wage everywhere is $15, they would probably have to raise it in those cities too because the living cost is much higher there than everywhere else. So, yes. Any more questions? Cool.
All right, let's get briefly.